Well, I'm sure most of us have been interviewed for something, maybe a job interview. Well, I doubt any of us have been interviewed for a crime. I kind of almost was once. My name was given by a grocer to the police about someone who robbed his store, and I was supposed to go to the grocer and show my face, Well, that's frightening. I thought, wow, it's not very far from jail here, is it? Well, of course, I didn't look like whoever that was. But I don't suppose any of you have been interviewed for a crime. Well, Jesus was, In fact, he was interviewed for a crime that could have meant his death, a capital crime. Let's see what Jesus does as he's been interrogating. He's being interrogated by the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. It's in John 18:33-38, and I'm reading from the Holman version, which is your pew Bible there. Then Pilate went back into the headquarters, summoned Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you asking this on your own, or have others told you about me?" "I'm not a Jew, am I?" Pilate answered. "Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" "My kingdom is not of this world," said Jesus. "If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. As it is, my kingdom does not have its origin here." "Oh, you are a king then?" Pilate asked. "You say that I'm a king," Jesus replied. "I was born for this, and I have come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." "What is truth?" said Pilate. And after he'd said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no grounds for charging him." Now, really, this interview must have taken quite a while because the other Gospels have other quotes from it. But John just goes right to the point he wants to make. And so he gives us this short scene. I'd like us to look at this scene to see what John's doing here. The more I have studied John, the more impressed I am with the quality of literature. It's like Shakespeare or something. You first read it, it's like the simple stories, right? This is an amazing book. Well, let's see what he's doing here. This is an odd interrogation because Jesus isn't afraid. He's not afraid of this Roman governor. But neither is he defiant. It's just like this normal conversation he's having with this man. Jesus wants to understand what Pilate is thinking and talking about in order to answer him. Jesus hears Pilate directly target the central question, as you would if you were used to interrogating prisoners. He goes right to the central question. Are you the king of the Jews? Now, this is the charge, and it's one of the major themes in John. Jesus is the king. The author started out by quoting Nathanael in his first chapter, John 1:49. Here's Nathanael saying, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." How did Nathanael know that? Then in the middle of his gospel, John also talks about Jesus as a king. You've all heard this story 100 times. Jesus fed 5,000 men there out in the wilderness out of just a little boy's lunch, or a boy's little lunch. And those people got so impressed with this, they decided that they wanted to make him king, regardless of what he wanted. So they were going to force him to become king. And of course, he took off into the mountains to hide from them and to pray. He wasn't about to be forced to be a political king. And that's a point that John is making. Don't worry about Jesus, Rome. Don't worry about persecuting us, thinking that we're going to try to rebel. Then, of course, not long before the scene that we're reading about today, not long before that, we have what we call the triumphal entry, when a whole parade entered Jerusalem. And we read about it in John 12:12-13. This is what it says. The next day, when a large crowd had come to the festival, heard that Jesus was coming into Jerusalem, they took palm branches and went out to meet him. And they kept shouting, Hosanna! He who comes in the name of the Lord is the blessed one, the King of Israel. And this commotion happened right in Jerusalem. And of course it was reported to Pilate. Pilate knew about this. He might have even watched it happen. But I'm not so sure he really understood what it was about. Because he wasn't a Jew, right? He didn't know about the whole symbol that riding in on a donkey thing. I don't think Pilate knew that. Well, this significance is what the Sanhedrin decided to fasten on. Because they knew Pilate wouldn't care about a religious controversy they were having. They wouldn't care about it. Pilate wouldn't care about a charge of blasphemy at all. But he would care about a peasant king who was leading a rebellion against Rome and against his government. So that's what they wanted to bring to him. Now, of course, here's Jesus standing before Pilate. And Pilate, of course, would expect someone who had some pretensions of being a king to have some kind of fancy clothes or something. But there's this normal guy, this simple Jewish guy standing here. So Pilate's, I think he's amused. This guy's the king of the Jews. Yeah, well, that figures, doesn't it? You know. So that's what he says. He says, you're the king of the Jews? This is a puzzle. Pilate doesn't really know what's going on here. As far as he's concerned, this whole thing is a tempest in a teapot. So he's not just sure what these religious leaders are bringing this fella to him. Why is this? But here's the interesting thing, that Jesus doesn't answer him. He needs to know what Pilate is thinking in order to answer him. So Jesus answers him with a question of his own. He says, are you asking this on your own? In other words, did you think of this by yourself? Or did others tell you about him? He wants to know if this is originated with the religious rulers. So Pilate knew that if he was, Jesus knew that if Pilate had heard he was a religious ruler of some kind, there would be no threat to Rome, and he'd be released. But if Pilate thought he was trying to be some sort of political king, that would be treason, and it would be a capital crime. So Jesus needed to know which one he was talking about here. And of course, Pilate is scornful of this guy. This guy, he's not even answering my questions. He asked me another question. So instead of saying anything to Jesus, he puts him in his place. He's just this Jewish peasant, and he's talking to me like this. So he says, I'm not a Jew, am I? But if he thought Jesus was going to be cowed by this, he was wrong. Okay, then Pilate indignantly reveals his source. He says, your own religious rulers brought you to me. What have you done? What have you done that upset him so much? It's interesting. I don't think Pilate has followed Jesus' career at all. Jesus has been all over Jerusalem doing miracles and all this, and that's all supposed to be like good, right? So Pilate's mystified. What is the problem here? Now Jesus knows how to answer. He knows Pilate will not see him as a threat if he answers in a religious context, so he tells him the truth. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. Now, isn't that interesting? I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. He didn't say I wouldn't be handed over to the Romans. I find that very interesting. So he's taken Rome right out of the picture. He's not saying I would be fighting against you, you see. I would be fighting against the Jews if I had that kind of pretension. But I don't, because my origin isn't there. As it is, my kingdom does not have its origin there. Jesus, you know what he's doing? He's trying to calm the situation, and he's trying to interest Pilate. He knows that Pilate isn't his enemy. Jesus' enemy are sitting out there in the porch waiting for the verdict to be delivered. Jesus is trying to save Pilate. He wants to stimulate belief in him that he is the Son of God, the King of Israel. A king who does not derive his authority from world systems like Rome or anywhere else, but it's from another place. This is interesting too. Notice that Jesus doesn't say from heaven or from God. He's being very coy here. He says, my origin is from another place. My kingdom is from another place. It's over there somewhere. Don't worry about it. If Jesus' kingdom was physical Israel, he's saying there'd be this fanatical mob that would be fighting on his behalf, but there isn't anybody. Clearly, you can see why it's going through Pilate's mind. Clearly, that the king of the Jews has no Jews following him. How can he be the king of the Jews? So he says, oh, so you are a king then, huh? A king with no followers, duh. Okay, so Pilate has one question answered anyway. Clearly this crazy man thinks he's a king, but he has no followers. So there's no threat here that Pilate can see. But Jesus hasn't finished his interview with Pilate. Pilate might be done, but Jesus is not done. Now, this is interesting because the commentators can't decide what Jesus means with this statement that's coming up. But as an actor, I kind of know, because an actor has to think about the subtext, the motivation underneath the words that are being said. And, I think this really needs some kind of Shakespearean actor or something to say these words to get the right sense of pondering and consideration, because Jesus is now thinking of how Pilate is forming these things. And he's wondering how he's going to approach his responses. So he says, you say that I'm a king. Jesus is wondering where Pilate is on his road to faith. So now Jesus is going to reveal something he hasn't revealed to very many people, if any, maybe to his disciples. But Pilate's not a disciple. But he's going to reveal this truth to Pilate about where he came from and who he really is. He hasn't even told the religious leaders this in so many words. And so this is what he tells them. I was born for this, and I have come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. All through the Gospels, we see Jesus teaching obliquely, teaching the truth, but in such a way that if God hasn't enlightened your mind, you have no idea what he's talking about, even though he's telling the truth blatantly and straight out there. But that's what he's doing with Pilate right here, but he's giving him straight out pretty much. He's giving him an opportunity to believe who he really is. Right here in his courtroom, Pilate is hearing the gospel from Jesus himself. Okay, now, Jesus has really opened himself up to Pilate. You know what this is like? It's like Superman taking off his glasses, Taking his identity and revealing himself. And here John brings us back to his first declaration about who Jesus is and where he comes from. It's, you're familiar with this. In first chapter of John, verses 1 and 2, he says, in the beginning was the Word, talking about Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. That's where Jesus came from. That's his origin. And he's told Pilate that the whole truth and nothing but the truth. He came into the world to declare this truth. God exists. God himself is king over all creation, and he's standing in your courtroom right before you. King of the universe. Pilate, that's who I am. Can you imagine what a blessing he's given to Pilate? But when he says the truth, Pilate probably thought he was one of these Greek philosopher kind of people. They're always pondering about what truth is and so on. And so I think this kind of went zip over Pilate's head initially anyway. He might have taken Jesus seriously, but he didn't know what he was talking about exactly. At any rate, Pilate saw no threat to Rome in this fellow that's standing here, this strange Jesus. So he went back out to tell the religious leaders, I don't find any charge in him. Or some of the versions say no fault in him. But he means charge. Nothing to charge him with. Okay. Of course, that verdict's not going to go over very well with the religious leaders. No, but that's next week. We'll talk about that. Right now, I want to talk about what Jesus was doing when he talked with Pilate and decided to disclose his supernatural origin. First of all, he didn't get offended at Pilate's obvious put down of the Jews. He could have. He did not spill everything he knew. He didn't buttonhole Pilate with the gospel message and try to make him feel guilty. Instead, look what he did. He first found out what Pilate already knew, and then he built on what Pilate knew already. So they had some common ground to start with. That's the way you do negotiations. You start with commonality and build on that. And that's the way you teach. When you're a teacher, you find out what the students know and you build on that. That's how you learn things. And so that's what he was doing with Pilate. It's just kind of a normal conversation. When you have a normal conversation, you give and take about your experiences and you build on each other's thoughts and ideas. That's what Jesus is doing with Pilate. He's sharing with him, building on his knowledge. So once Jesus knew that Pilate had learned that he claimed to be a king, Jesus explained what that meant. He said it in an intriguing way and perhaps reminded him about these myths that Pilate already knew from their history, of gods becoming human, Greek myths. And then, of course, he showed Pilate that he was no threat to Rome. And then he offered Pilate an opportunity to believe the truth he had just told him. He said, everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. So he's telling Pilate, hear what I'm telling you. Listen to this. And then he left it up to Pilate to decide what he wanted to do with that information. We have no idea what Pilate thought about it. We only know that from then on, he tried to set Jesus free. He kept trying to set him free. I think that's a good thing to remember about Pilate. This conversation revealed how Jesus revealed the truth to himself to Pilate. It's amazing to see because Jesus, the accused, is standing in Pilate's courtroom, yet he's friendly to him and he's welcoming. He's conversing with Pilate as if they're in a cafe over a cup of tea. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't defensive or attacking. Jesus, he's just standing there normal. Pilate's assured because of his demeanor, and he's possibly even interested and certainly realizes the man's not a threat. Understanding the way Jesus talked with Pilate is important for us because, last week, I talked to you folks who are just visiting for today. Last week we got together and we talked about what's the purpose for our church. And we discussed it. And it was a very interesting conversation, and I think Reba summarized the dilemma we have very clearly. This is what she said, something like this. She said that nearly everyone in town we know is a member of a church. And they get offended when you try to attract them to your church. And it only makes sense, wouldn't anybody? That's like this conversation I had with a local friend. I said, do you go to church? And he said, no, No, I don't. And I said, you want to come to our church? And he says, no, I'm a Lutheran. Yeah, so people get offended if you try to attract them to your church, even if they don't go to their own church. It's pretty normal. But last week, as I listened to you discuss this, I listened to what you were doing, what you had been doing for years, and I realized what our purpose is. I realized what our mission has been. This church welcomes strangers. That's what we do. Always have, I think. It's a resort community, and from the get-go, this church has welcomed strangers to the Prospect House to start with, I suppose. We welcome and enjoy everyone who walks through those doors. Without exception, without criticism, without questions. We just show interest in them. And at our snack time, we sit with them, and nobody sits alone. I've noticed this. You don't let people sit alone. That's a gift. I love that. You don't let anybody sit alone. I think you could even make a button with that on there. Nobody sits alone. And then we just talk like friends would. Of course, many of our already old friends. So, of course, we do. But some are not. And who knows? Some guests might even be drawn to Christ because of how they're accepted here through just normal conversation. This is also another reason why I ask us to share our praises and concerns out loud. I don't do a liturgical kind of service because I want people to feel conversational and like they're one of the family. And the best way to do that is to tell stories, and for visitors to hear us telling stories and praising God, and seeing God everywhere. It just feels like fellowship, I guess. It isn't formal. It's simply hospitable. I think we could say we have the spiritual gift of hospitality here. I know certainly Reba does. We've been staying at her place for, 7 years now? So, yeah. It's also why I stick to Bible sermons. I don't get into controversial issues. I try to teach what the Bible says about things and just work through the Bible. Bible knowledge is very important, and I think that our church memberships should understand what the Bible says and how it says it. That's why I preach that way. And I try to make every sermon freestanding, even though we're in a series for our visitors. We have a normal, joyful conversation about the daily relationship love we have with Christ. That's what we do. Now, I found something interesting on the internet. You can hand this handout. It's from a guy named Tim Chester. It's something on the Verge Network. It really defines the way we have been doing church. And it gives, at the end, one thing more that we could do. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can read it, but I'm just going to hit the bullet points here. We eat with other people. We work in public places. We are regular at the cafes and the pubs and the parks and the shops. We're present there. We join in on what's going on. And sometimes we leave the house in the evening. We go for walks. We go to events. We get with other people. We serve our neighbors. Man, yeah. On Friday, you saw that happening. They cleaned up the whole Battle Lake, right? We serve our neighbors. We share our passions. Gardening and all kinds of things that we do here in the Prospect House and the Art of the Lakes. We hang out with work colleagues. Now, maybe we're not talking work college because many of us are retired, but with the people we work with, we hang out with them. We go for walks, engaging our neighborhoods. We say hi to people and, what are you doing? Go for walks. And here's this last one, and I think this is a pretty interesting idea. I tried it yesterday. Walk around your neighborhood using what you see as fuel for prayer. Pray for the people in those houses. Pray for the businesses you walk by. Pray for the community groups and the community needs as they come to mind as you're walking through your town. Ask God to open your eyes to where He is at work and to fill your heart with love for your town, your neighborhood, the neighboring farms, Patsy. Yeah. So that's a good list, isn't it? And you can see that we've been doing this. And so that's quite a blessing, you know. I'm really proud of this church. I'd like to sing, "Oh, what a wonderful, wonderful day," 410.